Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another episode of Conversations in Practical Theology. My name is Saiyyidah Zaidi, and I'm joined here by my co-host, Eric Stoddart. Today, we're going to be looking at the subject of what is freedom. Now, freedom is quite an interesting word because it has many different definitions and connotations. In some ways, it's quite an individualistic concept. And so we thought that it would be quite a fascinating discussion to bring into this forum to really start looking at what is freedom from a spiritual perspective, from a political perspective, from a societal perspective. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So Eric, would you like to kind of kick us off with what you think freedom is?
Oh, I'm immediately going to Braveheart, the movie. You can't take our freedom. That's sort of etched on to the heart of every Scot, whatever their opinion about independence is, because I think between freedom and independence, not talking politically or about Scottish nationalism or anything, there is something about being an independent person, being able to make choices and being free to make those choices. But then I wonder, that is really quite individualistic, that every choice that I make is actually having some sort of impact on others. And why I make those decisions is also shaped by my relationship with other people. So freedom and independence, they're not absolute terms. They're very much, for me, community terms. And they're quite rightly, they've got boundaries around them because I'm part of communities, I'm part of society. There's always, and rightly so, limits on my freedom and limits on my independence.
And there's a lot to come back to in what you've just said. But one of the questions I think I would ask is, do you feel that those limits on your freedom, as you've described them, kind of hold you back, or is it something that you're willing to accept? Or actually, are you also party to that kind of decision of making those limits on your freedom?
Oh, I suppose it depends what precise instances of freedom we're talking about. The freedom to live securely in my own home. That to me is really, that's important, and that relies on me contributing to taxation. So there's a police force, there's a social structure, there are institutions and systems there. So in terms of personal safety, I think I have a lot of freedom, certainly in my part of Scotland. A lot of that's due to where I am socially, the colour of my skin, my accent, all those aspects of who I am actually makes me safer than some other people. But I know there are parts of Edinburgh where I live that I wouldn't go, certainly after dark. And I know now parts of Edinburgh that I would think twice about carrying a laptop with me, for example, down some of the small closes, the side streets in the centre of Edinburgh, even where there's lots of people. So that personal safety side and the freedom, it comes down to very specifics, really.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because for me, going back to what you said at the beginning in terms of the differentials between personal freedom and I suppose the freedom that society allows us to have, I think it is very much an individualistic thing. But and I'm just going to put it out there because I know people are going to be looking at this and thinking, how free is she really when she wears this cloth on her head, right? Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing about that is that for me, there is a freedom and a liberation that I feel as a result of the choices that I've made. And I'm very much in control of the choices that I make. And so by wearing this, for example, I don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of doing my hair and my makeup and all of these other things that other people who, they have freedom in doing that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's just that you do what you makes you feel liberated and free. And so for me, it is not spending 20 minutes or half an hour every day kind of like making sure that I've got no hair out of place. And it's quite interesting because as my son is getting older and he's becoming much more interested in how he looks, and so he's spending more and more time in the bathroom. And to me, and actually just spending time in the bathroom doing his hair, right? And to me, that's just wasted time, you know, because that time could be used doing something else. So yes, I wear and I'm very privileged and very lucky to be to afford the freedom to make the choice to dress how I wish, you know. And yes, there's holes in my socks, and there's, you know, there's all of it, but I don't feel as if I have to do anything for anybody else. This is about me making a conscious decision of how I dress and and actually it's interesting because what I'm now starting to think is that maybe we now live in a time where freedom has actually become associated with rebellion, or some elements of freedom have. So for example, if I choose not to wear makeup, and any makeup at all, that is actually a statement of rebellion, because even to look neutral these days, some people are still expected to wear some element of makeup just to make them look natural, you know. And again, I think it's all down to individual choice, but I think that perhaps what's happening in society is that our individual choice and our freedom is actually being governed by the wider mechanisms of the media and of politics, and societal norms are shifting as a result of who is able to influence the decision making. And so people still feel as if they're free, but their freedom is kind of being channeled in a particular way.
Absolutely right. And you know, clothing for me isn't there are no spiritual connotations that are obvious for me. But just as you're talking, I'm thinking, how free am I to choose the sorts of clothes I want to wear? Because I go down Princess Street in Edinburgh, and even worse, George Street in Edinburgh, which is the exclusive, very expensive males tailoring places. And I think, okay, on one point, I'm not free to choose whatever I want because I can't afford the really, really nice clothes. The other thing is I'm limited in freedom because certain clothes on me would just look silly. And then there's freedom that's constrained in terms of what's context. And that my freedom is always being shaped.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting actually, because we make very conscious decisions about how we choose to have freedom in our lives. And I you know, again, I do think that we live in a very privileged world where we're even able to have this conversation, you know. And it's funny that I don't know why I'm sharing this with you, but it kind of comes up. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to be wearing my abaya, which is, you know, the long kind of dress that Muslim women wear. I happened to just be wearing it inside out. Now, I hadn't read the news or anything, but my husband said to me, "Oh, you're wearing it inside out." And I was like, yeah, it just happens sometimes. And then he said, "Have you joined the protest that is taking place in Saudi?" Because apparently it was a particular day that they'd also decided that women were going to wear their abayas inside out as a protest to wearing of the abaya. Now, it's quite interesting that people think that they have freedom, but the choices, in some ways, and similarly to what you were saying, you know, that their choices are governed by uniforms. So there is an expectation. If you are a teacher, you dress in a particular way. If you are a minister or an imam, you dress in a particular way. If you are a professional, you dress in a particular way. Are those things freedom, or are they actually a way of being free, but are you articulating your kind of status, let's say, so that everybody else can see what your position is in the world without you having to explain it?
Oh yeah, I think signaling who we are using clothing and whatever freedoms that we have to make those choices it's part of our identity, and demonstrating to others where we think we are in relation to them in the pecking order. Mm-hmm. And just as I'm hearing you talk, I'm going to contradict myself from a couple of minutes ago when I said I don't think my clothing choices are about spirituality, because how I present myself to other people, how I view myself in the pecking order, that's about spirituality. That comes back to who I am as a spiritual person and the spiritual values that I have. So, yeah, my clothing choices are a spiritual issue.
Yeah, and does that awareness kind of change anything for you in terms of how free you feel?
I'm not sure if it makes me feel more free. It certainly makes me more conscious of why am I choosing to present myself in a particular way? Why do I want to either look well-dressed or casual? What am I trying to do in my relationship to other people to project myself? Am I trying to project something that is authentic? Or am I trying to project something that's aspirational? This is how I would like to be. This is how I'd like others to receive me. Is it something about how free would I be just to be myself? But then there are all the professional constraints and social constraints and things. So it probably, just as usual, makes it more complicated.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is probably something that it'd be really interesting to hear what other people think in terms of the clothing choices that they've made and how free or constrained they feel. So, like, if you're watching this or listening to this, and if you've got any thoughts, then please do share your comments below. I think kind of one of the other kind of aspects of freedom that we were speaking about in preparation for this conversation today was about the freedom that one feels when they are in let's say in an event or in wider society, and the freedom to kind of express yourself and turn up as who you are. And yet there are organizations that are out there who claim to be completely free and completely liberal, and they also have a set of rules, let's say, and if your freedom kind of challenges their definition of freedom, there's a very interesting tension that then gets created, because what you're doing is you're actually saying something different that may or may not be acceptable to them.
Yeah, and I wonder if thinking about it through phrases like politeness and kindness, because liberal society, being free, seems to me often very confrontational. But why would I hold back on the freedom to just be myself? Part of that would be out of politeness. Part of it would be kindness towards others. It's not right that I would just say what's ever in my mind about somebody. Their freedom to not hear my stream of consciousness. Yes, it's if you could call it a liberal freedom, but it's just plain kindness to be restrained.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even want to hear my own stream of consciousness, to be honest, because, and actually I think the thing is there's something very interesting about how our mind works and how it tricks us into certain things where we may feel as if we are being free, but actually we're being constrained by those thoughts that we have, and not every thought actually serves us well. Kind of coming back to what you were saying about liberalism, I think, everyone has the opportunity to feel completely free and to feel in control of who they are. Yet when you come across somebody or a group of people that have different values, that conversation that takes place between the two is very much aligned around patience, as you were saying, and about, actually it's to do with mutual respect as well. We all have different values for how we want to live our lives. And I would say that no one can kind of assume that somebody else from the same grouping or even from the same family has similar values, because it's very, very individualistic. And whilst people don't like I don't know, the use of the word prejudice is quite apt here, I think, because we all have our own prejudices, and the more aware we are of that, the easier it is for us to then be kinder, I think, and have more patience with other people. And kind of one of the, I think, a really, really important statement for me from the Quran is kind of like, you to your religion and me to mine, and that for me demonstrates that there is such strength in mutual respect and in ensuring that we value each other and everybody as kind of human beings. We all have choices to make, whether somebody chooses to follow the same faith as me or not. Actually, it's a choice. No one can, and even debates about how people dress or how people practice, it's all individualistic. The relationship at the end of the day is a freedom to choose between how you live your life and how you decide your relationship to be between you and God.
Yeah, and I think that's getting to the heart of not just that we would have freedom, but what's freedom for? And that, the answer to that, to me, doesn't often seem to be provided in typical arguments about liberal society and freedom. We've all got to have freedom. Well, yeah, why? Okay, so that we can make our own choices and decisions. But what's that freedom for that each of us would be hoping to have and ideally would give each other? That to me is there are real spiritual questions and contributions to that really deep question about what freedom's for. Freedom to flourish before God, what we believe God wants us to be.
Yeah.
That to me is the purpose of freedom.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you just say that again?
Yeah, it's about spiritual reasons for what freedom is for, that to flourish and to be before God what we believe God wants us to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that is the essence of personal freedom. It's about understanding who you are and being in a position to be able to express yourself doing that. I think in many ways, just kind of coming back to something that we touched on earlier on, the whole concept of how free can you be? I would like to think that within my own home, I can be as free as I want. I can dress how I want. I can, eat what I want, do really whatever I want to do, as long as it's within the bounds of the rule of law, And I think that that actually provides an enormous amount of freedom. In many ways, as soon as we decide to then step outside, we're actually looking at our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with God in a slightly different way, because when you're inside your own home, it's pretty much just you and God, right? When you're outside, it's you and God, but it's also everybody that you encounter, looking at how you are being And one could say, you know, as a kind of person of religion or not, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, you're still a human being, and as a creation of God, how are you being when you encounter other people? And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think talking about freedom of the home and freedom in the home seems really important in all of this, because it's the place where people learn how to be free, ideally how to manage their freedom as within a family, whatever sort of constitution of the family it is. It's a learning place and a space that needs to be protected so that people can be free, so they can learn what it means to be free. And then connecting outside the home maybe arises from there. Now, of course, that's just an ideal. It's not like that for everybody. But sort of the freedom and the protection of the home seems to be quite important.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would perhaps even expand that as well and say, actually, it's the freedom of an individual, you know, because your home can be lots of different places. And I would like to think that for me, I have the same kind of freedom in my home as I have in all of the different spaces that I encounter. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but I know that there are kind of public spaces that I can go to where I can just sit and, yeah, you know, I'm not somebody who likes to put my feet on the table and things like this, so it doesn't matter. But I suppose if you did want to do that, it would be easier for you to do at home than it would be for you to do in a coffee shop, you know. So in some ways, it's all about what, you know, if your rules, and are they rules? I don't know. If your kind of requirements for personal freedom are what is acceptable to society, I suppose it makes freedom much easier for you to attain.
Yes, if you're someone who's conforming to the general social expectations, you're going to have a lot of freedom to carry through those social expectations. And that gets a bit problematic when the social expectations could be oppressive, and you're expected to act in ways that are really not freeing for you. And whether that's showing affection in public, whether it's saying particular things politically that are unpopular, whether it's wearing clothes that are considered provocative, or that, it gets into really complex areas of what are the boundaries. There's almost that centre of freedom that you're talking about. Then there's a sort of another circle round about it that's a grey area, and beyond it there's the totally unacceptable. But it's what's in that sort of second concentric ring.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different things that come up in that I think we could talk about that would just take the conversation off into tangents. And even something like you know, breastfeeding in public, that's something that you know is a human right, but a lot of people see that as violation of their freedom because of something, you know, and yet it's become such a complex subject where in reality I think the solution for some of these things is quite easy, you know. I suppose it becomes very challenging in some ways when, you know, freedom and the definition of freedom for one individual is very different to the definition of freedom for somebody else.
Yeah, and when I see someone expressing their freedom in a way that I would certainly not do, and I feel uncomfortable about it, on my better days, I would reflect on that as to why am I reacting that way. On my not so good days, I would just harumph and inwardly complain. I probably wouldn't say anything. But it is maybe that challenge of thinking through, why is it that I find in that grey part of the concentric circle we're talking about, why do I find those practices, those clothes, those behaviours, why do those make me feel uncomfortable? Why do I don't like somebody practicing the freedom that way? How can I then think through spiritually, intellectually, whatever it is, why I react that way.
Yeah, it's and it's interesting because you're making me think of an incident that took place when I was last on an aeroplane, and we think that there are freedoms to be able to get on an aeroplane. There were also some kind of unwritten rules, and I don't know what it's like in Edinburgh, but in London, what tends to happen is that with the advent of mobile phones, sometimes people listen to their music or whatever it is that they're listening to without headphones. And you just kind of, yeah, exactly, but it's just become something that if it happens on the bus or on public transport, you just kind of accept it. And what was interesting was that when I was on the plane this time, there were 4 kind of middle-aged guys who decided to listen to their music on the aeroplane without headphones. And it was causing a disturbance to so many people. Now, in the context of freedom, we have a kind of interesting debate here, really, about are they able to express their freedom? Should we, as the other people, kind of not feel anything other than it's wonderful that they're allowed to do this? And should we not be supporting them? Or if we feel that our freedom and our space is being affected, that we just that we stand up and we say something. And in that instance, a few people did. And it then did create some tension, which the air stewardesses handled incredibly well. But interesting kind of concepts here of freedom, one person's freedom versus another person's.
Yeah, you're making me think I want to load up Scottish bagpipe music on my iPhone so that if somebody does that, I will retaliate. And the reason I think of that is there was an incident in St Andrews in the public, just sort of Market Square a couple of years ago, and there was a Christian street preacher who was saying lots of things that many people would have found quite offensive. And the solution to it was one young guy got out his bagpipes and expressed his freedom to play in public, just walking around the Market Square with the bagpipes. Of course, nobody could hear the preacher. So, that can escalate and can get pretty nasty. And maybe that's why a lot of us won't intervene or challenge what's really rudeness, basically. Nobody had, there was nothing in the UN Declaration of Human Rights that allows you to play music loudly to the discomfort of other people around about you. So, we're in the category of just bad manners.
So does that then mean that freedom
overlaps?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'm just saying, talking about bad manners sounds terribly old-fashioned, but some old-fashioned things are actually, they're how we oil the relationships in society. And
I suppose it's then, there are some rules around freedom, really, and it's then how free is the concept of freedom? And that, I think, is going to be a question that can keep us going until the end of time, because one person's freedom, and I think this is a very famous quote, isn't it? One person's freedom fighter and there's another person's what's the
terrorist.
Another person's terrorist. And the chat, I mean, kind of like bringing that into here is one person's freedom is another person's prison. So how we balance all of this is going to be a challenge in itself. And I think we won't find the solutions to freedom and the balance of what that is for individuals unless we are actually open to discussing and dialoguing some of these issues with other people and really understanding what is behind their definition of what freedom is for them.
Yeah, and understanding how others are expressing their freedom, what they decide is appropriate freedom for them, trying to understand that, that's a complex process, and it's a time-consuming process. Now, we can maybe do that with one or two colleagues or individuals we encounter, but when you scale that up into society, we need the societal mechanisms to do that for us. And therefore we have laws, we have social conventions about what is polite and what is decent to do, because we can't negotiate that with every single person.
Yeah, and so, but and it's simply the rules, for example, of you can't just break into somebody's house. They are all there to help us to ensure that we all have freedom, I think. And the societal rules, whilst some people might find some of them challenging, actually they're all there for kind of the greater good and overall protection, I think. And I think, certainly within the UK, we're not doing too badly. Yes, there is crime and there are a huge amount of issues when it comes to freedom, but it's the nuances of it. I wouldn't necessarily say as a concept we are challenged to accept it.
No, and I think our faith perspectives can help us think critically about the social expectations, the boundaries on freedom, because we've had to change those in the UK over the past even just 50 years. The freedom for women to be able to have a credit card, to be able to sign their own mortgage. Those were not just social conventions, they were legal things that 50, 60 years ago, that set the limits of women's freedom. And religious people often oppose that, but we now probably generally accept that. And we're always challenging, I think, and maybe that's a faith perspective, we can help contribute to that public debate about, well, is that boundary on freedom still appropriate? Or to whose advantage is it?
Yeah, and I think actually, perhaps it's a good point to kind of go back to scriptures and to the actual authentic texts and look at what they say about freedom and about individuals' rights, because certainly from my understanding of Islam, women have all of these rights. There was never anything to do with, you're not being able to own property or you being able to manage yourself, your finances, your freedom. But sadly, what has tended to happen is that in the interpretation of a lot of these texts, and I think this actually applies regardless of whichever faith group one is in, the interpretation of a lot of texts has curtailed freedoms for lots of different groups and members of society. And I think that, I'm not saying that the answer for everything is going back to the text, but I think that they give us a very good starting point.
And I think those ancient texts, as in our different communities, we're living those out. We're engaging critically with them because we're always asking, what does this mean for now? And that's never an individual thing. We do it individually, but it is something that we do corporately.
Yeah.
And the challenge of that and maybe this is where we come back to practical theology once again, that it's giving us tools to do that sort of thinking about how we are reading our scriptures, how we are understanding and reading our society and ourselves, and being more aware of, well, why would change happen? Why would freedom need to be curtailed or extended in specific areas? What are the implications for faith, practice, in those sorts of things? And I think practical theology helps us get into those sorts of discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, what is the experience of individuals going through life as a person of faith? I think that is very powerful. And perhaps, there will be some practical theologians out there that will start looking at this concept of freedom and the experience of freedom through faith. I think that would make some quite interesting research. Not one for me at the moment because I've still got a long way to go. But thank you so much, Eric, for such a wonderful discussion again on conversations in practical theology. This one's kind of gone in lots of different directions, as I didn't expect it to, as we always do. And to the audience, if you're watching, please share with us your thoughts and your comments and any observations that you've had. And if there's any subjects that you'd like us to consider, please put those in comments below this video or this audio as well. Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you again in another conversation in practical theology.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching and listening.